Hello React Native developers, what is going on? I'm so glad we can put one in the books before the end of the year, and this episode is all about mastering the classics. So welcome to Can It Be Done in React Native. This week we order some snacks. Hello guys, I hope you are well. William here, recording from, you know it, beautiful Zurich, Switzerland. I hope you're having a great end of the year holiday. And in this week's episode, we're looking at the Uber Eats app, and more specifically, the scrollable header when you look at a restaurant. So I can scroll through the menu here. So there's a nice transition from the title of the menu at below the image and the way it floats on the header when scrolling further away. And then when I reach some sections of the menu, the tab translates nicely. So scrollable headers are a very common example, requests of episodes for Can It Be Done in React Native. And indeed, there are really different kinds of configuration for scrollable headers. We've done one for Spotify. This one is certainly quite sophisticated and very interesting, I find. There's a couple of things that caught my attention while looking at this example. So first of all, you see that here, the way the opacity of the tab transitions, you cannot have a state of the gesture which is in between. So you see that it's not completely driven by the scroll, but rather the scrolling value drives should the tabs be visible or not, and then it nicely transitions from this state. But it's not the scroll value that drives the transition, which I find to be pretty interesting. And then we have these nice tabs, which you see goes from black, the text goes from black to white. Which means that we're going to need to use some sort of fancy mask. And thankfully now in React Native, we can have such a mask working on both iOS and Android. And so we have the title text that translates to the top of the menu. So the whole thing is very, very well orchestrated. So how would we do this in React Native? Well, by looking at this example, I see three layers. The background layer, which is the image. And the image here is going to scroll. So the image is going to translate to the same value than the scroll view. And if the scroll value is negative on iOS like this, we're going to increase the height of the image proportionally. So that's the background layer, three layers. The layer in the middle is actually the scroll view with the content that we're scrolling here, and you see the scrolling indicator on the right. And this content has some space at the top, which is transparent, so we can see the image in the background. And the third layer, the layer at the foreground, is this floatable header that we see here. And its opacity goes, when we reach the top, goes from 0 to 1. And it has some text, Miss Mu Europa Ale, which is always visible for any scrolling values. And that translates nicely from whatever is the top of the menu to maximum this position. So these are the three layers. The floatable header on the foreground, the scroll view as the middle layer, and the background layer is the image. So we're gonna listen to the Y animated value of the scroll view and use it to translate the text here and transition the opacity. So The opacity of the top tab bar is going to be 0 or 1 depending on the threshold value, but you see here it doesn't switch. It switched very smoothly, and we're going to use the with transition functions, which we introduced in the last video, called the 10-minute React Native transition. So that when we reach the scrolling threshold, we are going to transition from 0 to 1. And these functions are extremely useful, really, to decouple such animation problem, where we don't have to think about, oh, I need to, time a function to go from 0 to 1, and then if it scrolls back, I need to cancel and so on. No. There is a threshold, the opacity goes from 0 to 1, and then in a separate step, we use a transition function, which is going to nicely take care of transitioning from 0 to 1, 1 to 0, according to our needs. That's also the same recipe we used in a previous episode, the Google Chrome example, where we move tabs around, and the tabs are instantly switching from one position to the other, and then we add our transition function, so you see them nicely sliding from one position to the other. So we decouple the problem in two parts. So on the top header, then we have these nice horizontal tabs, and the way we're going to implement it is also, again, using a recipe we used already in the channel, which is a masked view. So this horizontal tab is, again, using 3 layers. We have the black, so the tab where the text is black in the background. We have the middle layer, which is this black background button. And this black background is animated according to the size of the text. So for each tab, we're going to measure the width of the tab using onLayout, so we can animate the width of this black background. And on top, we have a masked view so we have all the tabs written with white text, and we use a masked view, so that we see this nice transition from one menu element to the other. So that's a recipe we used already in the Google Chrome tabs buttons. I will link the video in the video description. So that's a recipe we are going to use. So I really like it because here there is really no new recipes. We're going to implement a scrollable header. We've done this before with the Spotify example. We're going to use transition functions to really enable the way we transition from the top header being visible or not. And then we're going to use a masked view for the horizontal tabs. So no new recipes, but really putting basically together everything that we know how to do: transitions, masked view, and dealing with a scroll view. And then actually we have the content, so these menu items, and we're going to use onLayout to measure the position of these titles. So for instance, here I have beam bar price. So I need to know when, for which scrolling value, I need to switch to the beam bar price. If I tap on one item, you see I scroll to fried chicken, which is actually no problem, because if we use a scroll view, we have really a bi-directional way to control the scroll view. So we are going to get the Y value from the scroll view to animate our things, but we can also set a reference to the scroll view, and then I tap a button because I know to which position I need to scroll. So I can use scroll to scroll to the proper item when tapping a button. But what do you guys think? Can it be done in React Native? Let's have a look. And before we get started, one thing: if you are looking to learn the fundamentals of declarative gestures and animations in React Native, I recommend you check out my online course at startreactnative.dev. My goal with this course is to provide you with all the tools and knowledge necessary in order to build incredible user experiences that will run at 60 FPS even on low-grade Android devices. If you follow this course, I can promise you that all the examples we are doing in this Can It Be Done in React Native YouTube series should feel trivial. I'm updating the course on a monthly basis. Right now, we are doing a big chapter on SVG animations, and we are building very, very cool things. And there are some incredible examples coming up. So if you're interested to learn the fundamentals of gestures and animations in React Native, I recommend you check it out at startreactnative.dev. Alright guys, let's get started. Here I have a boilerplate project which you can download from the video description in case you want to follow along with this example. And so I have the Uber Eats component, which has the 3 layers I just mentioned earlier: the header image in the background, the scroll view with the content in the middle, and the header on top. And in the content component, we do something quite interesting. So we have this on measurement event callback. And so we have the menu item here. Here they are, and some sections. And what we do is that we use on layout to measure the anchor. So it's a y value minus the height of the header, which we use to keep in the state. So in the tab, you see we have the name of the horizontal tab as well as the scrolling anchor. So we know when we scroll to this position, it's a threshold when we need to update the tab index, and vice versa. When we tap on the horizontal tab, we know where to scroll thanks to this anchor property. So these 3 layers, and then we have the horizontal tab, which we have here, which is again made of 3 layers, which I mentioned earlier. The tabs in the back, which are written in black. The view in the middle, which is this black background view that you see here. And the one on the foreground, which has the active property to set the text to be white, which you see here. So if I go to the tab, you see we have color. If it's active, it's white. And this is where we're going to use the mask view to, and the Y animation value to animate everything properly. But I suggest that we start first thing first. We're going to wrap scroll view into an animated component so we can get the Y value. And once we have the Y value, we're going to start to animate things. So let's go. So animated scroll view. I'm going to need to create a Y animation value. The Y animation value, because here you see every time we do on layout, we have a re-render. So we need to keep the Y animation value identity across re-renders. If you've been following the channel, you know that we use memo1 in order to do that. Now in Redash, there is a convenience function to create this default animation values with particular dependencies, which is called use values. And use values takes as parameter an array of default animation value, and you get an array of animation value as a return. So here it's going to be 0. And you can set the dependencies like for use effect or like for use memo1. And we can bind it to the on scroll event. Again, here we have a helper from Redash for that. Animated, which we get from reanimated. So it's on scroll. So that looks good. And first things first, now we should have the Y value. Let's use the Y value to animate the background image. So let me save this file. So here now we receive Y as a property, which is an animated node. So here we need to animate 2 things for this image. The top property, so it feels like it's going to scroll exactly, it's going to be synchronized with the scrolling of the content. So it's going to feel as if it's part of the same scroll view. And then the height, when we scroll, the scrolling values are negative. So let's start with the height. So image becomes animated image because we're going to use animation values. So height we're going to interpolate from the y value. So input range, let's say minus 100 and output 0. So output range. At 0, we know it's header image height. And at minus 100, you know that it's header image height plus 100. So it increases proportionally the height. And we know that it's only for negative scrolling values. So we need to clamp on the right side. So I'm going to write extrapolate right, extrapolate clamp. Let's have a look. I'm going to add it to the style. Okay, looks good. Now, if I scroll to the top, the image needs to scroll as well. So I'm going to create the top. So I'm going to interpolate on the y value. Input range. So we go from, do we scroll? No, we don't. So, okay, from 0 to, let's say 100, and output range is at 0, top is at 0, at 100, it's minus 100. And we extrapolate on the left side with a clamp. Let's have a look. Looks good, and it scrolls with the content. Perfect. So now let's take care of the header. So we're going to pass the y value to the header, which is an animated node. And here we're going to use to animate three things: the text, y and x translation. So it should be here on the x-axis and here on the y-axis when we're at scrolling position 0. And if we scroll down, it should scroll down to the content. And then the clamped position on the right side should be this one here. So translation 0 on x and y. Let's start with translate y. So translate y, we interpolate on the y-axis. If we scrolled, so input range is, if we scroll to header image height, we know that output range is 0. We know that we need to extrapolate on the right side with clamp. And if we are at minus 0, no, if we are image, okay, and if we're at 0, we should be at minus header height. Let's try. So I'm going to need to add the transform to the text. So array of transformation, translate y. I'm having some, okay, like this. And we should remove the header height. That looks good. Now let's do the, so, and it clamps nicely. Now let's do the translate x. So which again, we interpolate on the y-axis. So let me just copy this one. Input range at 0, it should be minus the width of this icon. So at header image height, it's 0. That's good. And at 0, it should be minus the width of this icon plus some padding. So it should be minus icon size plus padding. Extrapolate should be clamped everywhere. Yes, let's add it here. Let's have a look. Looks good. Now it translates nicely. We can do now the opacity here. So we're gonna create a toggle value. So is the header opacity toggled or not? Again, I'm gonna use values. Default value is 0. Doesn't matter, and I can type it as being we know that it's 0 or 1. Use values, we get from redash. There is a dependencies parameter, and we are gonna use code hook to set the toggle value. So we're gonna set the toggle value, and we need the dependency parameter. And if so, condition so is toggle value greater than so y is greater than header image height, the opacity is going to be 1 or 0. So this should be good. I need to import these guys. And so the interesting thing here, I'm going to bind for now opacity to toggle. So we're going to make sure the header opacity works great for this threshold value. And once this works, we're going to use width transition from redash to have the nice and smooth transition that is identical to the one from the Uber Eats app. So let's do that. So I'm going to bind opacity to toggle. And let me try to animate first the white background. I'm going to add opacity here. So it seems to work perfectly. And now I can create a variable called transition. And I'm going to use width transition from redash. I'm going to bind the toggle value to it. So width transition is using a default transition, a timing transition with default timing parameters. You can use a spring transition if you want instead, and you can customize the spring or the timing animation transition parameters. Here I'm going to use the default, so here I'm going to use transition instead. And so instead of abruptly switching from one to the other, you see the white background switches nicely. And let's do the opacity of the vertical tab and the arrow icon here. Let's do the tab opacity. So I'm going to pass transition here as property. Transition, which is an animated node. And the opacity here depends on this value. Okay. So it looks good. You see it nicely. And you don't have a value for which the transition is not 0 or 1. It's just nicely transitioned from one to the other. It looks very, very professional. Now let's do the icon color, and then we will do the vertical tab. So here we have the black icon. We're gonna overlay So if I go down, we're going to overlay a white. No, we're going to overlay the black. So we have a white icon. The black one is overlaid on top of the white one and becomes visible once the header is visible. So I'm going to use an absolute fill to. So it's going to be animated view. Absolute fill to overlay the icon, and then we're going to use opacity, which we have here. So animated view, style, so it's a style sheet absolute fill object, and opacity. Let's have a look. So it's white and it transitions nicely to black. Perfect. So now let's do the horizontal tab that we see here. So we have our tabs, we have the measurements. So in the tabs component, we use for each tab, we use on layout to measure the width of the tab. So in the state, we have the width of each tab because we know that's the width we need to apply to the black background, which we have here. And so you see here, if we want this text to appear black, we need to mask these foreground tabs with this black background view. So, and luckily now we can have masked view for both iOS and Android, which is a huge, I think it's a game changer for React Native to have this component now available for both platforms. It used to be that we could only do it on iOS. So I think it's really, really amazing. Since these layers are overlaid on top of each other, so this is done using an absolute fill. It means I need also to overlay the masked view using an absolute fill. And the masked element mask view we can import. So masked view we import from React Native community masked view. Perfect. So mask element. So this is gonna be this one. I mean, I'm gonna add animated view because we're gonna animate this property. But this is essentially our masked element. Let's have a look. So you see here, perfect. On the tabs of the foreground, the white tabs, only this part is masked, which is exactly what we were trying to do. Now let's animate when we reached. So you see when I scroll here, we have these anchors values for these section titles. And these we're going to use to animate the width of this black background view and translate the tabs, because it's always the selected tab is always on the left side. So let's, so we have the measurements. So what we're going to do is create an animation value where we're going to track the current index. So I'm going to call it index. We're going to use values to create it. So it's going to be a default value of number, and default value is 0. And now we're going to use code to update the index based on the Y scrolling value. I need the depth parameter. So I need the Y value, which is a animated node. We need probably to pass it as parameter here. So we have the Y animation value. So we're going to use code. It's a block. Dependencies. Now we are going to map over each tab. and we're going to write a condition to set the index, and the condition is, so then we set index to I, so I is the index of the tab, so we have tab I, and the condition is if if y is greater or equal of tab anchor and less than the next, and less than y is less than tabs the next tab anchor, so tab I plus 1 dot anchor, of course, except if it's the only tab, because then there is no tabs plus 1. So we need to check. So this is if it's not the last tab. So if it's the last tab, it means that I equals tabs.length minus 1. And here it just needs to be greater or equal than tab anchor. Need to import set. It looks I may have some syntax error. Let's try to clean this up. So that's the condition. If the condition is true, block. Oops. This looks correct. Okay, so the index value here should be updated properly. Let's test it here by animating the width of the black background, which we're going to interpolate from the y value. So we have width. So which we interpolate on the index value. So we have input range. We go from basically all tabs index, so tabs map. So we have tab index. Tab index will return index. So that's the input range. Output range is all these values, measurements values. Let's see. So here starter. Starter, order again, gets bigger, picked for you. So it looks that it might be working. In order to find out now, we need to translate these items properly. So we're going to calculate translate x, which we're going to also interpolate on the index value. Input range is the same. Output range, now we need to add the sum of all the width until the index we're currently at, plus the padding between the buttons. So output range for each tab. We need to do a reduce on the measurements to select all previous measurements. So we have measurements, we filter all the previous one and then do the sum. And then we need also to remove, so this is the translation value, and we need also to remove the padding, which is 8 pixels times index. So first one is 0, index 1 we have 1 padding, it's 8, 16 and so on. So here we filter to if, so sorry, j, so j is less than I. So here we filter the proper measurement. We need to do the sum of these measurements, and we're gonna do it using a radius. So it's gonna be accumulation. Yeah, looks good. Accumulation plus value. So it's gonna be acc plus m, and default value should be 0. Syntax error -8. Where is the syntax error? Measurements, filter. Okay. And then there is translate x, which we can apply to each tabs component, so the 2 tabs components. So I'm gonna wrap it here into an animated view, again with an absolute position fill, and we're gonna put the translate x value. So style is absolute fill object translate x. And let's do it also for the one in the masked view. Syntax error somewhere. Yes. Okay. Okay. So you see here it switches abruptly, but we can just add a transition to the index. And so I'm gonna call it index transition, and we're gonna use with transition. Again, here we use default value. You can configure it to a spring, timing animation, and so we're gonna use it here to animate the with and the translate x. I find these new transition functions to be super powerful, and you see it enables us to nicely animate from one value to the other. I really love it. I think it's very, very cool, and it looks very professional. So the fact that you see the index treated as discrete value is the header opaque or not treated as discrete values just based on the scrolling threshold, and then we use transition to have like really smooth transition. I think it's extremely it looks very professional. I think it's and it really shows how now we are really mastering these animation techniques to build these things very easily. And so it looks pretty good. I really like it. And so so here there is a bi-directional communication. So here we have the scroll view that animates everything, but we can also tap on the button potentially to scroll to a particular place. And the scroll view does that very well because we can listen to the Y animation value, and then it also provides a scroll to function which we can use when tapping a button, so we can scroll to the proper content. So we're going to do that. So we're going to create a reference. So scroll view, use ref. It's an animated scroll view. So we have ref scroll view, and we pass it as parameter to the header, and then as parameter to the tab header. So we receive it as parameter here, and I think so it's a ref object, and that's animated scroll view. And we need to pass it down to this one. Same story. Oh, let me save these files. So scroll view. We need to pass it down to the one in the background, I think. When we tap, we're probably actually tapping on the one that is invisible. Yes, this one. So if scroll view current, we scroll view current get node scroll to and y, so tabs at index anchor. And I think we're just, for safety, because of pixel rounding, we need to add 1 pixel. Am I having some? This one I can remove. Let's have a look. Okay. We have some issue here with the value initialization. The last one was selected first, but other than that, it seems to nicely switch to the proper values. And if I tap here on picked for you, it's selected nicely. So I can go to picked for you, go down, go up. It's pretty nice. Why at the start the first proper value is not correct? So here we have a weird initialization the very first time. Is it because of the dependency here with measurement? I think so. Let's try. Sorry, so I'm gonna try to add measurement either as a dependency. Index transition is index. Sorry about that. Yeah, you see now, because we've set the proper dependency to index, the initial value is correct. So I really love these scrolling headers, because so there's really different examples, different configurations. Some are simple, some are more complex. This one is somewhat sophisticated, but now we really have the tooling to build this very nicely. Guys, that was the last one for the year. I hope you enjoyed it. I am so excited about the upcoming episode in the new year, and I'm really looking forward to talk to you soon. We're going to build some incredible things together. And in the meantime, happy hacking.